I have a report from Chet Huntley in a few minutes. I'm David Brinkley, NBC News. In Chicago today, the U.S. Department of Labor was holding a hearing on charges the AFL-CIO construction unions discriminate against black workmen. During the hearing, hundreds of white union members milled outside the building and for a time blocked the entrance. Then somebody at the edge of the crowd pulled a gun, fired several shots. Nobody was hurt, but it became rough and disorderly.
White construction workers stopped yesterday's Labor Department hearing by packing the meeting room in a downtown hotel. Today's hearing was switched to the U.S. Customs House, but the unionists came out early by the thousands and sealed it off, denying entry to government officials, witnesses, and the press. The hearings are being held because of charges by the Black Coalition. And when coalition leader C.T. Vivian showed up this morning to testify, unionists moved in and police had to escort him to safety. Arthur Fletcher, Assistant Secretary of Labor, appeared next. He needed police help too, but finally got into the building through a basement entrance, as did others. As the crowd and the tension mounted, police called for reinforcements. Minutes later, several hundred more policemen moved in wearing blue riot helmets.
You're supposed to keep the street clear anyway. Back up on the curb, gentlemen.
The crowd stayed on, milling about on the sidewalks. Then someone fired 4 shots into the air, and the crowd moved in on 2 young blacks. That started the fighting. No one was wounded by the gunfire, but several policemen suffered injuries in the fighting, including one officer who had to be helped away.
In the course of
Despite the violence, today's hearing did get underway. One of the witnesses, Samuel Simmons of the Department of Housing and Urban Development, said his agency will recommend sanctions as a result of an investigation his agency made.
As a result of these investigations, I recommend to you that enforcement action to impose economic sanctions in the form of prohibition of future contracts and the cancellation of existing contracts be taken pursuant to executive order upon 17 of the contractors whom we investigated and upon other contractors who may, after investigation, be found to have engaged in similar practices.
Labor Department officials here say the public hearings will continue tomorrow. Bill Matney, NBC News, Chicago.
Number 1.
The Huntley-Brinkley Report is produced by NBC News and brought to you in color.
Since you give your little boy enough food for a man, does he still need to take vitamins? You never know. You've given him a big ham sandwich, a real mouthful, and his favorite peanut butter, a piece of fruit. But you see how it is. That's why we make one-a-day vitamins, so you can be sure you'll get all the important vitamins he usually needs to take. Give your whole family one-a-day vitamins, because you never know.
It is clear that most of the country has turned against the war, and there is some dissatisfaction with President Nixon's speed or lack of speed in ending it. But it remains true that the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong are doing nothing to help. They're continuing their savagery and brutality against the civilians in the South, and at the Paris peace talks, they refuse to talk peace. After today's meeting in Paris, Ambassador Lodge said, "I am sorry to report they seem more rigid than they have been in months."
In Washington today, Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird said he was hopeful that the South Vietnamese could soon begin to take on much more responsibility for the war. He said the replacement of American combat troops by South Vietnamese soldiers was an opening step in the right direction.
The 60,000 man redeployments that will have been accomplished by December 15th are tangible evidence of the progress that is being made in beginning to Vietnamize the war and to move towards troop replacements. And this troop replacement program, as you know, started on July 1st of this year. But let me make one thing very clear, ladies and gentlemen. Vietnamization means a lot more than modernization of the South Vietnamese armed forces. It means progress in the transfer to the South Vietnamese of responsibilities of all aspects of the war and the management of their own affairs. I believe that we should follow the course of action that we're presently on. We have had no progress in Paris, and there has not been a substantial reduction in the level of activity as far as the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese. And I would hope that all Americans, whether they be in the Congress or outside the Congress, would give the President support for this program. That is the thing that Hanoi will understand, and that is important if we are going to have success in negotiations.
Secretary Laird says that Hanoi will be easier to deal with if everyone supports the policy of turning over responsibility for the war to the South Vietnamese themselves. The trouble with that idea is that President Thieu of South Vietnam does not seem to agree. Thieu said last week that American troop withdrawals next year will not depend so much on the ability of the South Vietnamese to do more for themselves. He said that future withdrawals of American troops will depend more on a reduction of enemy action or on signs of progress in the Paris peace talks. Thieu said he got this as a promise from President Nixon, and the White House denies that. In any case, there are different kinds of signals reaching the North Vietnamese. Among them are the increasing demands in the American Congress for a quick pullout of Vietnam. Senator Charles Goodell of New York said today that all American combat troops should be withdrawn by December of next year.
45,000 young Americans have already died in Vietnam in the past 6 years. Today, American soldiers fall at the average rate of 150 a week. This slaughter must cease. The prosecution of the war with American troops must be ended, not just reduced. The only way of halting the loss of our young men's lives is to establish a clear timetable for terminating all American combat operations and troop commitments in Vietnam within the near future. It is time for the South Vietnamese to make hard and realistic decisions without the protective mantle of American troops. It is time we told the South Vietnamese leaders that 1 year from now, they will be on their own.
One of the lawyers in Vietnam for the Green Beret accused of murder says the whole case is a mess and a bungle, and says he will ask President Nixon to call it off, all of it. Nobody knows how far he will get with that. In the casualty figures issued today, there were 135 more deaths of Americans, mostly young. More than 1,000 were wounded. The deaths and injuries among Vietnamese civilians are unknown because nobody keeps the figures, but they are high.
Watch the new Homelite EZ, the only super lightweight chainsaw with the guts to take a tree 3 feet in diameter, just in case you should ever want to. It's ideal for limbing, pruning, and bucking, too. The new EZ is the lightest chainsaw Homelite ever built. Just 8 1/2 pounds, plus cutting attachments. And you wouldn't believe how easy it is to start. 2 fingers, lift, and away you go. You can cut up enough firewood in an afternoon to last you through the whole winter. The Homelite EZ is the chainsaw with professional performance, designed for the weekend woodsman. Visit your Homelite dealer soon and see how easy it is to be a weekend woodsman with a Homelite EZ. By the makers of the world's fastest-selling chainsaws. Find us in the Yellow Pages.
The foreign minister of Egypt said in New York last night his country eventually would be willing to meet with the Israelis to talk peace, and that Israel would not be asked to give up the conquered lands as a precondition for peace talks. Today in Cairo, the Egyptian government issued an angry denial. It said it would never negotiate directly with Israel and it said yesterday's reports were fabricated by New York news agencies sympathetic to Israel. The report was not fabricated. So apparently there was a lack of communication between Cairo and its foreign minister in New York.
The Middle East crisis occupied center stage at the White House today with the arrival of Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir. The president's aides had arranged a warm welcome for the Israeli leader, as they had for Jordan's King Hussein a few months ago. But if Richard Nixon was trying to wield an even-handed policy, Mrs. Meir was quick to remind all of the traditional friendship between the United States and Israel.
Mr. President, the ties between our two countries are rooted in the biblical heritage and in a common dedication to human dignity, freedom, and to democracy. It is this sense of affinity that has encouraged us to ask for America's understanding and support in difficult times. I look forward to the day when an Israel Prime Minister will be able to come here bearing to the President and the people of the United States the tidings that the Middle East has entered a new epoch of amity and regional cooperation. From Jerusalem, the city of prophecy and universal inspiration, I bring you the traditional Hebrew greeting, Shalom.
Later, Mrs. Meir told the president of the economic and military needs of Israel. The president, mindful of the 50 Phantom jets now being delivered to Israel by the United States, apparently made no further commitments. Herbert Kaplow, NBC News, Washington.
The hearing on Judge Haynesworth's nomination to the Supreme Court went on today. A union leader said Haynesworth was part of a conspiracy against the textile unions in the South. Clarence Mitchell of the NAACP said as a judge he dispensed civil rights to Negroes with an eyedropper at a time when they should be flowing like a rushing stream. Another witness, Joseph L. Rao, Jr., said he was a secret segregationist. The best information we get is that Judge Haynesworth will be confirmed. In Chicago, they were trying 8 people charged with conspiracy in those riots during the Democratic conventions last summer.
As jury selection began this morning, Judge Julius Hoffman explained to the group of 350 prospective jurors that the indictment against the 8 defendants was not evidence, that it was merely a means of preferring a charge. Then Judge Hoffman began to read from the indictment. The 8 men, he said, did unlawfully, willfully, and knowingly conspire, confederate, and agree together to break the 1968 anti-riot law by coming to Chicago to incite, organize, promote, encourage, participate in, and carry on a riot. Defense attorney William Kunstler rose to complain that there was no way for the record to show the voice inflections the judge was using, like Orson Welles reading the Declaration of Independence, he said. Judge Hoffman replied in a voice that was a mixture of sweetness and sarcasm, "I am grateful that you would compare me with Orson Welles. He is one of the great actors of our day. While I overrule your objection, sir, I have never been so complimented." Hoffman asked if any of the prospective jurors felt they could not be impartial. At first, only 7 raised their hands. Then more and more stood up until finally 58 had asked to be excused because they had some feelings about the case. Of the first panel of 12 seated, government attorneys challenged only 1, the only one under 40, a recently graduated university student. Defense attorneys conferred for a few moments, then objected to 3, 1 a government employee, and 2 with friends or relatives who are policemen. The jury that was finally selected was composed of 10 women and 2 men. Opening arguments will be heard tomorrow. John Dancy, NBC News, Chicago.